In 1953, the budget of a single American behavioral research program quietly exceeded 6% of the total intelligence allocation of its parent agency. Yet most of the Congress of the United States never saw a line of it. From that quiet appropriation grew a family of experiments, failures, and reckonings that would later be remembered under the shorthand of Project Macotra, a life story often reduced to myth. But built from paper trails, invoices, and sworn testimony, the problem that created, it did not begin with monsters. It began with fear. The war of 1939 to 1945 had ended with mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within 5 years the rivalry of superpowers hardened into the early Cold War. Intelligence officers spoke of brainwashing after the trials in Moscow, and the confessions of prisoners in the Korean War, and the fear of coercive persuasion became a bureaucratic driver. A lesser-known design compromise of the early program was the decision to scatter sub-projects across universities and hospitals to preserve deniability, which fragmented oversight and made coherent scientific evaluation difficult. The parents of the program were not a single mad scientist, but a set of institutions. The Central Intelligence Agency, parts of the Department of Defense, contracted researchers at American universities. In a political climate shaped by the National Security Act of 1947, the doctrine of containment, articulated in cables and speeches, created appetite for tools that promised leverage without open war. In 1953, Director Allen Dulles authorized a formal umbrella for behavioral research that included chemical, biological, and psychological lines of inquiry. A lesser-known test result from early LSD trials showed that the intensity of hallucinations varied dramatically with setting and expectation, an early empirical hint of what psychologists later call set and setting. Its birthplace was administrative, not cinematic. The program inherited files from earlier efforts such as Bluebird and Artichoke, and it absorbed a vocabulary of special interrogation techniques. Estimates vary on the total number of sub-projects often cited around 149. But what is clear is the pattern of contracting work to institutions without disclosing the true sponsor. A lesser-known production issue was the reliance on shell foundations to route funds, which created accounting anomalies that later investigators used to reconstruct the scope of activity. Childhood was messy. The early years were a scatter of chemical procurement, hypnosis trials, and sensory deprivation studies. Researchers tested LSD, mescaline, and other compounds, sometimes on unwitting subjects, sometimes on volunteers who were not fully informed. A lesser-known supply constraint affected these trials. Pharmaceutical-grade LSD was scarce in the early 1950s, leading to inconsistent dosages and batch variability that complicated interpretation of outcomes. In laboratories from Montreal to California, scientists asked whether drugs could break resistance or implant suggestions. The program intersected with academic psychiatry, and in some cases, it funded work that had legitimate therapeutic aims but opaque sponsorship. In 1957, the agency purchased large quantities of LSD from Sandoz to secure supply, an act that reflected the bureaucratic scale of interest. A lesser-known crew training detail was that some agency officers received briefings on how to recognize signs of drug intoxication in detainees, an operational adjunct to the research. Misunderstandings accumulated. Popular culture later painted a picture of programmable assassins. But contemporaneous documents reveal a more prosaic struggle with unreliable effects and ethical blind spots. The technical challenge was not merely inducing hallucinations, but achieving predictable behavioral compliance under stress. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation, though no battlefield was officially acknowledged, was the use of safe houses. In cities like San Francisco and New York City, where prostitutes were paid to lure men so that reactions to dosed drinks could be observed behind one-way mirrors, small changes mattered more than grand ambitions. The shift from overt testing to covert administration altered the moral terrain and the legal risk. The introduction of sensory deprivation tanks, inspired in part by work at McGill University, aimed to disorient subjects without chemicals. A lesser-known countermeasure that emerged from internal debate was the recommendation to limit dosage escalation after adverse reactions, a recognition that unpredictability threatened both ethics and utility. Growth arrived not with a single breakthrough, but with bureaucracy. Budgets expanded during the early 1950s, and the number of contracts multiplied. Standardization took the form of forms cover letters, grant agreements, and progress reports that concealed sponsorship. A lesser-known medical effect recorded in some files was prolonged anxiety and depressive symptoms in certain subjects after LSD exposure, complicating claims of reversible impact. The system around the program matured. There were manuals of tradecraft, liaison relationships with military laboratories, and procurement pipelines for chemicals and equipment. In 1963, an internal Inspector General report criticized aspects of the program, noting insufficient documentation of consent in some cases. A lesser-known weather and terrain impacts surfaced in field notes. Temperature and noise levels in safe houses appeared to amplify disorientation, a variable that operators noted without fully understanding. By the early 1960s, the cultural environment was shifting. Public discourse about civil liberties was widening, and the press began to probe the edges of intelligence activities. The program's architects faced a paradox. The more they sought control over the human mind, the more they encountered its variability. A lesser-known command doctrine shift occurred when emphasis moved from drug-induced compliance to broader research on personality assessment and interrogation resistance. Reflecting disappointment with chemical predictability, peak fear came, not from a battlefield, but from revelation. In 1975, the United States Senate convened the Church Committee to investigate intelligence abuses. Hearings aired details of secret experiments, and the name MK Ultra entered public vocabulary. A lesser-known production issue complicated the investigation. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of many MK Ultra files, leaving gaps that estimates vary in filling. The defining scenario was not a firefight, but testimony. Survivors described confusion and harm. Officials described context and fear of adversaries. The committee reported that drugs had been administered to unwitting subjects in at least some instances, and that oversight had been inadequate. A lesser-known psychological effect noted by observers was the erosion of public trust in intelligence institutions, measurable in opinion polls of the mid-1970s. Why did it work, if it worked at all? In narrow contexts, drugs could lower inhibitions or induce disorientation, but reliable truth extraction or behavioral programming remained elusive. The promise of a chemical key to the human will proved overstated. A lesser-known countermeasure, adopted by adversaries and allies alike, was improved training in interrogation resistance, emphasizing rapport and information analysis over pharmacology. The cost was human. Subjects reported panic, paranoia, and in some cases, long-term distress. Families of those affected sought answers, and compensation and litigation followed. A lesser-known medical detail surfaced in reviews. Certain individuals with latent mental health vulnerabilities appeared more susceptible to prolonged adverse reactions, a finding that underscored the risks of indiscriminate testing. Fatigue and fear were not confined to subjects. Researchers navigated moral ambiguity, some later expressing regret. Intelligence officers balanced perceived national necessity against ethical boundaries that were evolving in law and culture. A lesser-known crew training detail emerged in reforms. By the late 1970s, human subject research tied to federal agencies required clearer consent procedures. Influenced by broader bioethics developments, old age came with policy, executive orders. In 1976 and 1978, restricted certain intelligence activities, and congressional oversight committees were strengthened. The ethos of experimentation without transparent consent faced legal and reputational constraints. A lesser-known supply constraint in the later years was not chemical, but political. Appropriations became contingent on compliance with new reporting requirements. Replacement did not mean disappearance. Research on psychology continued in academic, in military settings, but under different frameworks of review. Interrogation doctrine evolved toward wrapper-based methods and analytic tradecraft. A lesser-known command doctrinal shift in the post-9/11 era reignited debates about coercion, though under distinct programs and legal rationales separate from MKULTRA. Legacy is uneven. Later designs in intelligence and defense copied the lesson that human variability resists simple control, and that secrecy corrodes accountability when unchecked. Universities tightened policies on funding transparency. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation of reform was the embedding of legal counsel and operational planning, a structural attempt to prevent recurrence. The name persists in culture, often inflated beyond documentation. Conspiracy narratives attribute to it capabilities unsupported by declassified records. Yet the documented history is heavy enough. Contracts signed, doses administered, files destroyed, hearings held. A lesser-known weather of culture riff one can borrow. The metaphor shifted in the 1970s toward skepticism of authority, and M-culture became a symbol within that climate. Birth was fear. Childhood was experimentation without full map or compass. Growth was bureaucracy and budget. Peak was exposure under oath. The cost was measured in trust as much as in trauma. A lesser-known design compromise that echoes through the decades is the tension between secrecy for security and transparency for democracy. The balance is never static. Old age is not silence but cautionary memory. Intelligence agencies of many nations continue research on influence and persuasion, but within clearer ethical codes. Courts, committees, and historians revisit the archives, filling gaps left by shredders in time. A lesser-known production issue for historians is the reliance on surviving financial ledgers to reconstruct scope, a method born of necessity after document destruction. Legacy is a quiet line. The life story of a program that sought mastery over minds ends not with mastery, but with limits. Numbers, remainers, budgets, subprojects, but the enduring figure is the boundary of what a state may do in secret. A lesser-known psychological effect of that boundary is restraint. Knowledge that some tools, even if technically possible, carry costs that outlive their use. In the end, the monster was not a creature, but a mirror. It reflected the anxieties of an era and the temptations of power. It grew in shadow and met daylight in hearing rooms and history books. And the quiet moral is this: when fear writes the first draft of policy, oversight must write the second. By 1977, fewer than 20,000 pages of financial records survived to map a program that had once spanned more than 100 sub-projects, and even that figure is an estimate. The rest had been fed into shredders in 1973, a bureaucratic act that shaped the afterlife of Project MKUltra as much as any experiment ever did. The destruction order came during the directorship of Richard Helms, at the close of a period when scrutiny of intelligence activities was intensifying. Files stored at a record center in Virginia were eliminated, leaving investigators later to reconstruct events from grant ledgers and testimony. A lesser-known production issue of this archival purge was that budget routing through front foundations inadvertently preserved fragments, because accountants keep copies even when operators do not. In 1977, a cache of financial documents was discovered in a separate CIA records system, not touched by their earlier destruction. That discovery allowed reporters and senators to trace payments to specific institutions, including universities and hospitals, a lesser-known design compromise of the original funding model using innocuous project. Titles became a liability when cross-referenced with tax filings and annual reports. The renewed public attention did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader reckoning that included surveillance, revelations, and debates over executive power. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees, established in the mid-1970s, formalized oversight mechanisms that had previously been ad hoc. A lesser-known command doctrine shift inside the agency was the creation of more explicit legal review for special activities. A procedural barrier intended to prevent repetition of earlier ambiguity, the human dimension continued to surface. In litigation in Canada, work conducted by psychiatrist Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, funded in part through CIA-linked grants, became a focal point of controversy. Former patients alleged harm from psychic driving and intensive treatments. A lesser-known medical effect noted in subsequent reviews was persistent memory impairment reported by some of Cameron's patients, though causation debates have continued for decades. In the United States, civil suits led to settlements in a limited number of cases. One of the most cited tragedies was the death of Frank Olson in 1953 after unwitting exposure to LSD. Decades later, his family received compensation and a formal apology from the U.S. government. A lesser-known psychological detail in that case was the documented paranoia Olson experienced in the days after dosing, captured in Contemporaneous Notes illustrating the acute volatility of high-dose LSD outside controlled therapeutic settings. As the program aged into public memory, its image bifurcated. On one side stood declassified documents, Senate reports, and Inspector General findings. On the other stood a growing mythology amplified by novels, films, and talk radio. A lesser-known countermeasure adopted by intelligence agencies in response to conspiracy narratives was proactive declassification of selected historical programs, a strategy aimed at controlling rumor through partial transparency. The numbers remained stubborn. Anchors. MKUltra began formally in 1953 and was officially halted in 1973. A 20-year span marked by shifts in leadership and geopolitical tension. Estimates vary on total spending, but figures in the tens of millions of dollars are commonly cited in congressional materials. A lesser-known supply constraint in later years was not chemical, but reputational, as academic communities grew wary of undisclosed sponsorship. Recruitment of researchers without full disclosure became more difficult. The broader scientific context evolved. In 1974, the United States passed the National Research Act, establishing institutional review boards for federally funded research involving human subjects. The Belmont Report of 1979 articulated principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. A lesser-known crew training detail that followed in federal research settings was mandatory. Certification in humans object protections for investigators, a procedural legacy indirectly linked to earlier abuses. The Cold War itself shifted terrain. By the late 1970s and 1980s, intelligence priorities expanded towards signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance, domains less dependent on experimental manipulation of individuals. Advances in computing changed the texture of analysis. A lesser-known battlefield. Improvisation of the analytic community was the early use of computerized databases to correlate human intelligence reports, reducing reliance on coercive extraction by improving synthesis of voluntary sources. Yet the idea of mind control proved culturally durable. In music, television, and cinema, references to secret programming became shorthand for hidden power. The distance between documented capability and imagined omnipotence widened. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact in this cultural climate was the rise of the internet in the 1990s, which amplified archival fragments into global narratives within hours. Internationally, revelations about MKUltra influenced debates in allied nations about oversight of intelligence services, Parliamentary committees in countries such as Canada and the United Kingdom examined their own frameworks. A lesser-known command doctrine shift in several democracies was a formalization of ministerial warrants for intrusive operations, a structural safeguard intended to distribute responsibility beyond a single agency. The scientific community also reassessed LSD itself. Research into psychedelics largely stalled after the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified LSD as Schedule I in the United States. Decades later, limited clinical studies resumed under strict protocols. A lesser-known test result from modern trials at institutions such as Johns Hopkins University has suggested potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics for certain conditions. A stark contrast to the coercive context of earlier intelligence experiments. The arc of Imcotra's life reveals a pattern of ambition colliding with complexity. The hope for a reliable pharmacologic level over human will encountered the variability of psychology and the ethics of consent. Documents show internal doubts, alongside external secrecy. A lesser-known design compromise at the conceptual level was the conflation of interrogation efficacy with scientific rigor. Operational urgency often outpaced methodological control. In the realm of law, precedent accumulated. Court decisions and settlements reinforced the principle that government research on human subjects requires informed consent. Freedom of Information Act requests became tools for historians and journalists to peel back layers of classification. A lesser-known production issue for agencies became the burden of long-term records retention policies designed to prevent future gaps that could erode public confidence. Old age for a program is not decayed but integration into institutional memory. Training courses for intelligence officers now include case studies of past controversies. The cautionary tale serves as both shield and warning. A lesser-known psychological effect within agencies has been the cultivation of risk aversion in certain domains, a counterbalance to the aggressive experimentation of earlier decades. Replacement technologies emerged not as mind control but as data control. Surveillance systems, metadata analysis, and behavioral analytics became tools of influence in the digital era. These developments raised their own ethical debates, distinct yet resonant. A lesser-known countermeasure adopted by civil society has been encryption at scale, a technological response to perceived overreach. The legacy of MKUltra is therefore layered. It influenced bioethics, congressional oversight, archival practices, and public skepticism. It did not produce a controllable monster, but it revealed a capacity of institutions to rationalize extraordinary measures under perceived threat. A lesser-known medical lesson drawn from postmortem analyses of the program is the importance of longitudinal follow-up in assessing psychological interventions, something largely absent in the 1950s trials. In the quiet of archives, historians continue to trace its contours. Financial vouchers, travel reimbursements, and coded correspondence form a mosaic of intent and outcome. The gaps left by destruction orders ensure that some questions remain open. A lesser-known supply constraint for researchers today is the uneven declassification across agencies, which shapes narratives by what is available rather than by what fully occurred. The life story closes not with a dramatic finale, but with institutional sediment. Policies were rewritten. Oversight was formalized. Cultural memory absorbed a cautionary emblem. The numbers 1953 to 1973. Dozens of sub-projects, millions of dollars, sank of the tale in documented fact. And the final measure is not of control achieved, but of limits learned. In the contest between secrecy and accountability, the balance shifted, however imperfectly. The monster imagined in headlines dissolves under scrutiny into memoranda and meeting minutes. What remains is the enduring requirement that power over human beings, especially in the name of security, demands scrutiny equal to its reach.